the Pope and the papal authority to the entire, all of England. So up until the English Reformation, the Archbishop of Canterbury was in what they called full communion with Rome, which just means that they were an extension of Rome's power. After the English Reformation, what ends up happening is, obviously, the Anglican Church gets established. When the Anglican Church gets established, the Archbishop of Canterbury becomes separated and no longer in what they call full communion with Rome, and the Archbishop of Canterbury becomes the head of the Anglican Church. There had been some variety in who got to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. Sometimes it would be the reigning monarch of England at the time. Other times it would be monks living in monks living in one of the local monasteries, or even the basically faculty of the Canterbury Cathedral. Sometimes even the Pope himself would appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, but that's that role. Okay, so the life of Anselm of Canterbury. He was born in Aosta, Burgundy, which is now what we would call modern-day northern Italy. His father was a guy named Gundolf. He was a Lombard noble. His mother was Ermenberg, beautiful name. She was the granddaughter of another noble figure. And their marriage was likely arranged, and she had like really big castles, and she had like nice villas and things like that. But she was considered the more religious of his two parents, and as such, they raised him in the church. So Anselm, being raised in the Roman church, he wanted to join the local monastery at the age of only 15. 15 years old, really young, and he really loves this. So he's living in this beautiful town. That's, I think, what it looks like today. I don't know, it could look different now than maybe 10 years ago when this was taken, but that is a picture of the valley where he was raised. So he's all around this nature. He just gets to go and study. He has super wealthy parents, not a care in the world, and what more would he want to do? What would he want to do more in the world than go become a monk in a monastery? So he goes and he applies, but the abbot won't let him join because his dad says, no, I'm not going to let you join. His mother had passed away at 12. There can't be any, Mom, please Dad, let me join. She was gone. So when his dad said, no, you can't join the monastery, it was out. And the legend is, there's lots of legends about these figures. The legend is, he was so disappointed that he couldn't join the monastery at 15 years old that he became seriously, gravely ill, and that he didn't recover for many weeks, and he was on the brink of death. And then after that, he was just fine. So his classical education was really key. His classical education had two profound effects. The first one was that he became proficient in Latin, and the second one is that he became proficient in writing, and his writing was renowned for its clarity and ease of understanding. So Anselm's time at the Abbey of the Alps with only one attendant, and he proceeded to wander through Burgundy. A vagabond. He was kind of doing the thing that people do sometimes now, where they'll go to France and walk around for a really long time when you're young. So upon learning that his countrymen, a guy from the place that he was born, Aosta, his countrymen had a guy named Lanfranc, who's really important to his life story, was the prior or an abbey underneath an abbot or any of the monks. You could study there without having to become a monk yourself. So he says, hey, one of my countrymen's over here, I want to go study with him. Well, Anselm was basically convinced after heading there and hanging out with Lanfranc and learning from the monks there, he was convinced that he should join the monastery himself. So he did that at the age of 27 in the year 1060. Anselm's first years in the monastery, he wrote a philosophical work, his first one in the first few years he was there, so he's still only 27, 30 years old. It was called Grammarian, and it was a treatment of Latin paradoxes. His thought was said to have been greatly influenced by the rule of St. Benedict while he was there and the accompanying lifestyle of asceticism during his time at the abbey. In 1063, when Anselm was about 30 years old, his friend Lanfranc was summoned by Duke Cain a few dozen miles to the east of Bec. His friend was summoned by Duke William II to serve as the abbot of William's newly constructed, so Duke William II has constructed this new abbot for himself, and he convinced Lanfranc to go there and serve as the new abbot. So his friend's now a few dozen miles to the east, no big deal, but while he's there, after Lanfranc's departure, the Abbey of Our Lady Bec was in need of a new prior, and Anselm was elected by the monks of the monastery to be the new prior. 15 years later, in 1079, after the death of the abbot of Our Lady Bec's, it was a warrior monk. They called him a warrior monk. He was a warrior turned monk. But after this gentleman passed away, his name was Herluin. Anselm was elected as the new abbot. Under Anselm, the Abbey of Bec became the most prominent center of learning in all of Europe. So Anselm is by far head and shoulders above the rest of the people at this place. His teaching, his writing, the ways that he's thinking about God, some of these things that he's coming up with, including the ontological argument, which we'll go over later. These are things which have set him head and shoulders above the rest, and with him goes the rest of the monastery. So the monastery is world-renowned. People are coming from all over the Western world to study at this monastery, particularly under Anselm. So Anselm becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's the next big phase of his life. And after cultivating wide renown as the successful abbot of the Abbey in Bec, Anselm had caught the attention of many prominent figures at the time. People want Anselm to come and be maybe the archbishop, the bishop, maybe the abbot of their monastery. And he's famous for having, throughout his lifetime, people knew him as having upheld monastic ideals, which are still associated with him today. And the Anselm monastic ideals are stewardship, prudence, proper instruction, prayer, and contemplation. Basically, there was a sincerity to Anselm that wasn't necessarily prominent in the church at the time. This really set him apart. Anselm's friend and the former prior of his monastery, Lanfranc, had been promoted from the abbot of St. Stephen, where the warrior monk had brought him, to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Lanfranc's promotion was organized by the King of England, William I, who had also held control of Normandy, having been the first king to be born in Normandy. Anselm would regularly go visit his friend in England, and while he was there, he gained the favor of King William I and the Cathedral of Canterbury. So everyone in the Cathedral of Canterbury, really big fan of Anselm at this point because they're getting to know him when he comes to visit Lanfranc. And also Lanfranc, who was pretty close with King William I, well, he's getting to introduce Anselm to King William I, and King William I likes Anselm, which is interesting because Anselm's you're going to find a little bit later that Anselm has this, he's being pulled between the crown authorities and between the papacy. And this is all during the investiture controversy, so this is a time when the crown is trying to do everything that it can to delegitimize the rule of Rome, and simultaneously, Rome is trying to do everything it can to delegitimize the authority, even just like the normal goings-on of life of the authorities of the king. So upon Lanfranc and William I's eventual death, William II, oh, sorry, one more thing. So Anselm had favor in the eyes of the king and in the eyes of everyone at the Cathedral of Canterbury. And they all had this idea, like, we don't want Lanfranc to die, but he's pretty old. If he ever dies, we think we want Anselm. And so, unfortunately, King William I perished before that could ever happen, and Lanfranc perished shortly thereafter. But even though they had talked about having Anselm installed as the Archbishop of Canterbury, William I's son, William II, who we will call William the Red, not because of blood or anything. His name is William Rufus, which means red, and so they call him William the Red. But William the Red, he swore that as long as he was the king, he would never reappoint someone to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Because if he could get away with not having an Archbishop of Canterbury while he was there, that means that the church isn't really able to compete with his power there, okay? So right after swearing that he would never, as long as he lives, install anyone, especially not Anselm, to the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury, well, he gets really, really ill. And of course, what do you do when you get really, really ill in the medieval days? You all of a sudden start to turn back and decide to repent of all your wrongdoings and try to make amends with everyone. So he decides that he must be ill because of this horrible, grievous sin that he's committed against the church. And so he decides that he's going to have Anselm come over, and he's going to have Anselm appointed as the Archbishop of Lee. As soon as he said this, all of the monks, the clerics who were serving him, immediately went and got his crozier, stuck it into his hands, and brought him to a church to try and get him to legitimize, okay, he's saying he's going to make him the archbishop, let's go ahead and make this happen. Unfortunately, that wasn't exactly how it worked, because Anselm refused to accept the role of Archbishop of Canterbury unless certain conditions were met. And the conditions that he wanted met were conditions which would further consolidate power to Rome. So Anselm's already starting to work his agenda here of trying to work out the Gregorian reforms and even reforming England and consolidating power for the church there. So first, William the Red was like, no way, I'm not going to return the lands that I've claimed from the church. I'm not going to accept your spiritual counsel to me, and I'm definitely not going to swear loyalty to Pope Urban. Though Anselm had fought for the Gregorian reforms and aided in consolidating power back to the papacy in England, there was still trouble. As it turned out, William the Red, who was really ill when he decided to finally appoint Anselm of Canterbury, he didn't die. He got better. which is a problem because he really doesn't like Anselm. And so he gets better, and he all of a sudden, he doesn't have that repentant attitude he had before. They don't get along. And there's this one story where William the Red sought to invade Normandy, okay? So even though we had said that William I, he had been born in Normandy and that he had united them, well, he did, but he gave his son, Robert II, control over Normandy. And William the Red, he didn't like that. He was like, I want my brother's territory too. And so he goes and basically says to Anselm, look, I need all my people, I need everyone in all the powerful people to pay me a sum of money so that I can sort of simultaneously show that you are giving me your blessing, that I can go invade my brother's territory, because it's sort of a sketchy thing to do, but also so that I can buy, war effort stuff. So he says to Anselm, I need you to give me some money. And then Anselm says, okay, whatever, I'll give you 500 pounds. And then, so William the Red, he goes and confers with his council, and they're like, no, Anselm's a big deal, man. He's worth at least 1,000 pounds. So he goes back to Anselm, and he says, okay, Anselm, you have to pay 1,000 pounds, just for you. You have to pay 1,000 pounds. And Anselm says, you know what? I think that 500 pounds I was going to give you, I actually donated it to the poor. So it's kind of gone. So sorry about that. And William the Red famously declared that he didn't need Anselm's blessing. He hated him before, he hates him now, and he'll hate him all the more when he comes back. So Anselm's first exile came when William the Red refused, different occasion, to allow Anselm to visit Rome to seek Pope Urban II's counsel. William had given Anselm a choice, either exile or total submission to the king. So you can stay, have total submission to the king, refuse to go back to Rome and tie the position of Archbishop to Canterbury further to the rule of Rome, or you can go ahead and leave, go to Rome, see your pope all you want, and you're never coming back. So he just left. He was like, whatever. And he goes back, and he actually goes to Pope Urban II and begs Pope Urban II to let him to, Henry sends a letter to Anselm and says, hey, if you come back, I'll do whatever you want. I'll swear to, take your wisdom, and I'll stop doing the lay investiture where the king invests in his own bishops. He says, I won't do any of that. You can have your demands. That's fine. Come on back, please. So Anselm, he decides to go along with this. And when he does, there's another problem, because the guy who had begged him to come back, Henry, well, he has some trouble with Pope Paschal, who's Urban II's successor, and he asks Anselm to go visit Rome and get a different opinion from the Pope. So go change the Pope's mind. So Anselm leaves, and he goes to try and change the Pope's mind. He is so frustrated with Henry trying to get his mind changed that he says, you know what, Henry? All of the bishops that you've ever appointed and everyone you've ever appointed in the church, they're all out. They're all excommunicated. So not just deposed, they're actually out of the church. They're totally gone, cut off. And if you're not careful, I'll depose you from your position as the king. And so that kind of puts him in a weird spot. And then Anselm, he's trying to balance this, because if he does ever go back, he's going to have to live at peace with this guy. He says, he actually writes this letter at a really critical time to the king, Henry, and he says, Henry, I'm actually going to, if you don't sort of submit and step back, I'm going to support the Pope's deposing of you. And so Henry finally, he relents, and he decides to go to Bec, request Anselm to return, and agrees to submit to all of the things, including no longer, oh, this is a great one. He says to Anselm that if he comes back, all of the clergy will be exempt from taxes for 3 years. So Anselm's final years, because of Anselm, control over the church in England was largely consolidated back to Rome and the papacy. So really big deal, because what this does is not only functionally consolidate power back to Rome, but in the eyes of the people, they're going to view the church as more powerful than the king. So that's really important. Henry agreed to renounce the right of the English kings to invest in bishops and the church, to invest in the bishops of the church, that's not right, to install, basically, the investiture controversy and investing, so they will no longer be investing bishops to people to power. So in the public discourse, the power and authority of the papacy over the secular rulers was further strengthened, with the Roman Church now being even more influential in the world. Anselm also requested that Pope Paschal recognize the Archbishop of Canterbury over the Archbishop of York. So York being in that same region, there was sort of this, they were sort of equals, and he had convinced Pope Paschal to make it to where, nope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's like the only guy for that whole area, which is really important, because when the English Reformation comes along, that makes it to where all they have to do is get the Archbishop of Canterbury on their side to step away from the Pope and break communion with him. And so it's kind of interesting. I think that's one of those dominoes that were lined up perfectly for when the Reformation eventually came along. Anselm, at the end of his life, said that he had one regret. he had this book that he really wanted to write on the nature of the soul, and he never got to write it. He said, I don't think anybody smart enough will come along that'll write it, so that's disappointing. And then he died on April 21st, 1109. His body was brought to Canterbury Cathedral, and he was buried at the head of his friend, Lanfranc. Okay, so what did this Anselm guy actually teach? What is he, like, why is he known? He's known a lot because of the, power struggles and how he managed to carefully and delicately walk that balance between the papal authority and the crown. But he's also known for his teaching, and he has a lot of teaching that's still really helpful for the church today. Some of it's very controversial. We'll get into that. But Anselm had this approach to theology. He's considered the scholastic movement within the church, and many of the ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were being rediscovered after many dark years, okay? It was actually the Muslims who were sort of recovering those things and bringing them back to the forefront, and that's actually where the church got those writings back from. So Plato and Aristotle, I don't know if you've studied them, but that's largely influencing how Anselm is thinking, and specifically it's elevating human reason back to the forefront of people's minds, even in the theology world, which later on you'd have Martin Luther come along, and he really doesn't like this. He calls using reason in the realm of theology and thinking and talking about God a word that I can't say because we're in a church. So a theological question, and then attempt to solve that theological question with reason. This way he's starting from a faith-based presupposition. A lot of people get confused about Anselm because they think that his arguments are from a different angle. They think that maybe he's trying to be evangelical, or he's trying to evangelize. He's trying to do apologetics. That's not the case. He's starting from a faith-based presupposition. He's trying to say, how can my faith help me further understand the things that I believe? So Anselm's approach to theology was unique. It was ultimately why he's really well known. He had this saying, credo ut intelligam, which means I believe so that I understand. And people have twisted some of these phrases. I'll talk about it. But ultimately, he's trying to say reason alone is not enough to bring someone to a point of faith. But faith is a prerequisite to having true understanding. He says, unless I believe first, then I won't be able to understand. This is really similar to what Augustine of Hippo taught when he said, believe so that you may understand. The position of Anselm is often described as fides quaerens intellicum, which means faith seeking understanding. Some modern scholars will try to argue that Anselm's point here is that faith alone is nonsense and that we have to bring understanding to it, like faith seeks understanding because faith on its own is insufficient. That's not his point. That's not his point at all. He's trying to say faith, he's trying to say that's what I'm doing. He's not saying that's what you have to do. He's saying that's what I'm doing. I have faith. It's undeniable. I have this God. I'm loyal to him. All else falls short. But I'm seeking understanding to go along with and bolster and encourage my faith. So in this study, you have Anselm's ontological argument. He wrote this book, it's right there, but the Proslogion. There's another book that he wrote that was sort of the precursor to this, that had his first version of the ontological argument. It was not very well received. He didn't like it. He didn't feel very comfortable with how some of the arguments fell short. And so he writes the second book, even while he's actually living as a monk at the original abbey that he was at, the Abbey of Our Lady Beck. I'm going to read you guys the argument. This is a really controversial argument. I think that the thing that seems to make this controversial is that people think that it's trying to prove God's existence. You can see the argument is not intended to persuade atheists at all. The argument is trying to use his reason to help better understand this God that he already loves and worships and adores. So here's the argument. First presupposition. Arguments are structured in presuppositions, thoughts, sort of this and then this, therefore this. So the first one is, truly there is a God, although the fool does say in his heart, there is no God. But that's really it. First, truly, there is a God. Second, we believe that God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. So there's a God, and we believe that being God, nothing greater than him can be conceived, thought of in our minds. And then he says, hence, even the atheist is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least that which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears this, he understands this. He can conceptualize this being in his mind of which nothing greater can be conceived. And whatever is understood in the mind exists in the understanding, so it really exists up here. And assuredly, that which nothing greater than can be conceived can't exist in the understanding alone. If it only exists in the mind, it's not the greatest thing that can be conceived. It'd have to exist in real life to be better, because what exists in the mind is less than what exists in the real world. For suppose, he says, it exists in the understanding alone. Then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is even greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. So, again, probably no one is going to be persuaded to the existence of God on that argument. The argument can be summed up this way. God is the greatest being. When you think about God, he is the greatest being. A being which exists is greater than a being which doesn't exist. Therefore, God exists. This has been really controversial at the time with how they were thinking, Platonic thinking about things like the forms and having these a priori concepts. It's a big word I won't explain. It's not worth explaining right now. But in this time frame, that makes sense to them. In our world, we don't really understand things, and we can't really understand arguments, and the way that science is done, it's all in the world of the observed. So unless I can observe it, it's not legitimate. Like, how can I test it? The scientific method. And there's nothing wrong with that to some extent, but he's not trying to do that. He's saying, no, I already have faith that this God exists. That's the very first presupposition that he has, is that God is the greatest being. That's the very first thing he says is that there is a God, even though the fool says in his heart there is no God. So he gets a lot of flack for that. It's controversial because for a lot of people it's insufficient. But it's kind of insufficient because it's not meant to be sufficient to convince you that God exists. And just because you don't understand his argument doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. We don't believe that God exists because of Anselm of Canterbury's argument, and he's probably really thankful that that's true. We believe that God exists because it's in accordance to his word. We have faith in his word, and we know that that faith comes from the Holy Spirit, right, through the work of Christ. So, interesting thing. Now you know, that's Anselm's argument. God is the greatest being. A being which exists must be greater than a being which does not exist. Therefore, God exists. The other big thing he's famous for is the satisfaction theory of the atonement. This gets into a little bit of heavy stuff. So he writes a book called Cur Deus Homo, which means Why God Became Man. This is his third book that he ever wrote. In this book, Anselm is again starting from a presupposition of faith and trying to come to a greater understanding of his faith through the application of reason. To preface, up until this point in church history, there had been a large variety of theories about what's happening at the atonement. These theories of the atonement are trying to answer the question of what exactly is happening at the cross. So you have one theory, Origen. He claims that his theory of the atonement is the ransom theory, that Christ offered himself as a ransom to the devil. And allegedly the devil had been holding mankind ransom, and that God decided, because he's so much smarter than the devil, that he's going to trick the devil by sending Christ in man's stead, and that pays the ransom. Men get to go free. If you're shaking your head like, that's kind of what Anselm did too. So another prominent theory was Ambrose in the 5th century, around the same time as Augustine. Ambrose has this theory of the atonement where he just says that the atonement is a satisfaction of God's sentence of death. But then he doesn't really elaborate. So he's not wrong. But Augustine comes along in the 5th century also. He says the sacrifice of Christ is reconciling us to God. That's true. But he doesn't really elaborate. And for Augustine, he's explaining that Christ's atonement for sin is paying a debt we owe, but he doesn't go as far as to say that something that Christ accomplishes is given to us on our behalf. For him, justification and sanctification are really, really close, and he kind of conflates those two things. So we know now that it's not enough that Christ should come and pay the debt we owe, right, or take on the punishment that we deserved, something also, a righteousness has to also be given to us, right? And we know that the perfect life that he lived, which is pleasing in the sight of the Father, is attributed to us through his death. That's sort of what Augustine was missing, although I'm sure Augustine would likely agree with that. He just wasn't there yet. He didn't have anybody to read. He probably did, but. Okay, so Anselm comes along, and he's got this more modern take. It's actually really, really similar to our penal substitutionary theory of the atonement, which is really good. Here's the penal substitutionary atonement theory. Let me find out. I don't want to mess this one up. So the penal substitutionary theory of the atonement is expressed in terms of sort of legality. Okay, so it's saying that in the cosmic court of God's law, mankind has broken the law, and the sentence was given. Ezekiel 18:20, the soul who sins shall die. So we've sinned against an almighty, holy, incredible, set apart from creation, eternal God. We, as his creation, we have broken his law, and in breaking his law, now there needs to be consequence, right? And we know that the only thing that protects the pure, righteous holiness of God is when that sin is punished. Either the sinner will bear the punishment eternally, or the punishment will fall on God's Son, Christ. God cannot simply forgive the sin without punishment, because in doing so, his own holiness, justice, and integrity would be called into question. It's a little MacArthur for you. So Anselm, he's going to have a really similar argument, except he's not thinking in terms of the legal stuff like we're talking about it. He's thinking in terms of his own context, which is like honor. So in the medieval times, if you insulted someone's honor, then they would demand either that you be punished for insulting their honor, or that there would be some kind of satisfaction. You have to make satisfaction for insulting my honor. Well, man can't make satisfaction for his honor. So here's what Anselm says. He says, as God's creation, man owes God total submission to his will. Man, in sinning, has dishonored God. Therefore, God must demand vindication for this dishonor. This is where the debt is. Man owes God a debt of honor. God would not have integrity if he just said, it's okay, don't worry about it. You don't have to repay this debt. So therefore, there's two things that God could do to restore or to vindicate himself after this dishonor. The first thing is that he could demand punishment, which would ruin the human race. There would be no salvation. Or he could demand a satisfaction. Well, that sounds really nice, but the problem is that man dishonored God, and therefore it must be man who pays satisfaction to God. Man dishonors God. Man has to be the one to pay the satisfaction. But man is not capable of paying the satisfaction to God. He has nothing that he can do to accomplish that. God could do it, right? But God doesn't need to do it because God didn't dishonor himself. So no person individually can offer more than what he is owed. It was a man that dishonored God. It must be a man who pays satisfaction to God. So God's gift is his Son, and some reasons. As a human being and infinite, he died on the cross and satisfies God's honor. Only God could offer this kind of satisfaction, but only man owed the debt and could pay it, because Christ did not owe the debt. So this is kind of getting into the something being given to our account. So Christ pays the debt that we owe, but he also didn't owe God a debt. So in paying for the debt that we owe, without owing himself a debt, a reward is given to him for what he's done. And this reward is sort of a kind of righteousness in Anselm's mind, is given to us. And so that's sort of where we first start to see this double imputation, where our sin, our iniquity, our dishonoring God is put onto Christ on the cross, and yet his righteous life and that he lived is attributed to us, or given to us, imputed to us. So that's pretty much Anselm in a nutshell. In doing this study, I have some thoughts. First, the thoughts on the business of the church. So it's really easy when you look at church history. It looks not just like modern day. It looks not just like the politics of the time, but it looks like it is the politics of the time. It looks so much worse than even things we see today. It's like such a mess. And it's interesting that a lot of times the famous people that you hear about are, you don't really hear about priests. You don't really hear about, any kind of pastoral ministry. And I have to wonder, was it just not happening? Or is it because they were focused on doing the real business of the church and trying to go to individuals, trying to go to widows, trying to go to orphans? That's the real business of the church. We have General Assembly, our denomination does, coming up next week, and we're going to conduct business. Steve was praying on Wednesday night, and in his prayer he mentioned that Even though that's really a big deal, and in the eyes of the world, that's where the business of the church happens. But in Steve's prayer, he noted that really, perhaps the more valuable, the real ministry and the real work of the church and the real business of the church would be VBS coming up. And that really stood out to me while I was studying this, is that all of these people are getting caught up in trying to consolidate power to Rome and trying to create a name for themselves and figuring out how to establish their own legacy, and that's just not the business of the church. Another thing that I thought about was when studying the ontological argument and when studying the theory of the atonement, I think that's fair. I think that all men by nature desire to know. I think that it's good that we want to understand what we believe. I think that's really good. That's why we're all here in this class, is because we want to add understanding to what we believe. To a certain extent, that's really good. But beyond a certain point, when you start having discussions about how many angels can dance on the head of a needle, that's maybe not very helpful. So I think some discernment is necessary when we're trying to learn. There are some questions like we just don't really, there are so many things happening at the atonement. I mean, it's like all of human history. It's not like this is the reality. All of human history, all of the circumstances and events of the world were set up by God in such a way that when Christ comes, that's the culmination of all time. And that's really hard to sum up in like one theory of the atonement. There's sort of a lot of things going on. And so I think it's just good to have it's not that it's like a mystery or that it's unknowable like the Eastern Church might say. It's just that there has to be a kind of maybe ontological humility, or in other words, we have to recognize that as created beings on this side of heaven, we don't have complete, total, and full perfect knowledge. And so there might need to be some room for relying more on faith and embracing faith as a good friend that never lets us down, where reason sometimes leads us down weird paths. And remember, Martin Luther hated reason, so I don't know. There you go. Finally, thoughts on nope, that's everything. That's all my thoughts. Any questions?
As the guy who kind of brought forward the substitutionary atonement theory?
I wouldn't say he brought forth the substitutionary atonement theory. It's just that in his theory of the satisfaction theory, we see the first sort of shape of what's now the substitutionary atonement theory.
Nobody had really brought it up.
No, but it's really easy to see the parallels between substitutionary atonement versus this satisfaction theory. One is dealing with God's honor has been hurt. We owe a debt of honor to him, and that can be satisfied through Christ. The other one is saying in God's law, and that there needs to be punishment, and that there's a sentence that comes along with that, and somebody has to serve that sentence, and that's Christ. Any other questions?
Go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead. You mentioned the other doctrines of the atonement. You can turn the TV on this afternoon and see them. I mean, you've got prosperity gospel preachers still preach the ransom theory, that Christ's death was paid to the devil. Christians need to be really discerning because the language at times sounds good. There must be a substitutionary work where one died in the place of another, or we do not have a gospel.
Absolutely. So Anselm, the reason he doesn't like what Origen says about the ransom theory is that look at his ontological argument. He says God is the greatest being and the being which no other being that's greater can be conceived of. And so Anselm literally looks at that and he says, that can't possibly be right. The devil has nothing to do with what transpired between man sinning against God. And not only does the devil have nothing to do with it directly, and aside from assisting in that matter, the devil has nothing to do with the debt that's owed and the repairing of that debt. But also, God doesn't need to trick the devil. What are we talking about, tricking the devil? God doesn't need to trick anyone. He's not a trickster, and he wouldn't need to condescend to engage with the devil like that. That's just not how that would work. So that's good. Anything else? Then we'll close.
Seen things in the Bible that existed by this time, and really contemplating them. The Bible makes very clear about that there was a God-man and the second Adam and all of that stuff. So I think he's starting to, what he's trying to think about is listening to Scripture. What is Scripture telling me about things? Second comment is that his ontological argument survives to this day.
Oh, yeah.
It is explain things. It is what other philosophers attack in more modern ages, and they try and defeat the ontological argument. And so it still receives opposition
Absolutely.
to things. So what he contributes has lasting effect on people continue to attack it to this day.
Absolutely.
So he's trying to unpack scripture with what he's doing. So he doesn't, in that sense, he doesn't invent substitutionary atonement.
Right.
He sees it in scripture and attempts to explain it. Keep in mind, there's also all of these other contra. Was he really man? Was he really God?
Right.
You know, all of these things are preceding this, and he says, you know, his contribution basically boils down, he needed to be both to affect salvation.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. That's really good. Yeah, Anselm, the reason why his argument for the atonement appears in that book, Why God Became Man, is because for him, the incarnation was tied with the atonement really, really closely. God had to become man in order to atone for the sins of mankind. Really excellent. And yeah, he is a really influential guy. If you take any religion or philosophy class today, you'll likely study him and his ontological argument. He wrote his books as sort of prayers and devotions, and I think there's a legitimacy to what he's trying to do and a kind of reverence that maybe doesn't come across in a 45-minute class. So that being said, we're 4 minutes over. Let me close in prayer. God, thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your wisdom, Lord. Thank you for being the Father of all reason. You're the one from whom